The morning Thomas Harding left London for what would become the most haunting disappearance in Antarctic exploration history, the weather was unusually warm for March 2005. He stood at Heathrow Terminal 5, checking his equipment list one final time, unaware that within weeks his name would be whispered in research stations across the frozen continent like a ghost story that refused to die. The young British explorer, barely 28, but already carrying the confidence of someone who had conquered Everest twice, was heading to the eastern coast of Antarctica on what everyone believed was a routine glacial melting study. Everyone, that is, except Thomas himself. His colleague, Dr. Elena Petrova, had driven him to the airport that morning, and even now, 15 years later, she could still remember the strange intensity in his blue eyes when he spoke about the mission. There was something different about this trip, something he wasn't telling her. The way he gripped his journal a little too tightly, the way he avoided direct eye contact when she asked about his research parameters. Thomas had always been methodical, almost obsessively organized, but that morning he seemed distracted, as if his mind was already somewhere far beyond the reaches of conventional science. The official mission briefing stated that Harding would spend 6 weeks collecting ice core samples and documenting glacial recession patterns along the Amery ice shelf, standard work for someone with his credentials from the British Antarctic Survey. But Elena knew Thomas well enough to recognize when he was holding back information. They had worked together on 3 previous expeditions, and she had never seen him pack quite so many extra journals or spend so much time studying satellite imagery that wasn't part of their assigned research zone. What made Thomas's case particularly unsettling was how perfectly normal everything appeared on paper. His equipment check was flawless. His route was approved and well documented. His emergency protocols were thorough. Even his communication schedule was precise. Daily radio contact at 1800 hours GMT, weather permitting. For the first week, everything went exactly according to plan. His voice crackled through the static each evening, reporting ice measurements and wind patterns with the professional detachment that had made him one of the most trusted field researchers in polar science. But there were subtle changes that only someone who knew him intimately would notice. Elena played those early radio transmissions hundreds of times in the years that followed, analyzing every pause, every slight change in tone. By day 4, Thomas's reports were becoming increasingly technical, almost mechanical. By day 7, he was mentioning equipment readings that didn't match the instruments he was supposed to be carrying. By day 10, he was asking questions about geological surveys that had nothing to do with glacial melting studies. The last confirmed radio contact came on March 22, 2005, at exactly 1800 hours GMT. Thomas's voice was clear, professional, almost cheerful as he reported moderate wind conditions and successful sample collection from grid reference Delta 7. He signed off with his usual phrase, "See you on the flip side, Cambridge." Elena was monitoring from the research station in Rothera, and she remembered feeling relieved that he sounded so normal. She had been worrying unnecessarily, she told herself. Thomas was fine. Thomas was always fine. 24 hours later, silence. The search operation that followed was methodical and extensive, covering over 800 square kilometers of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. Helicopter teams from multiple international research stations combed the ice fields where Thomas should have been working. They found his base camp exactly where it should be, his equipment neatly organized, his samples properly labeled and stored. His sleeping bag was undisturbed, as if he had simply stepped outside for a routine measurement and never returned. What puzzled the search teams most was the complete absence of tracks leading away from the camp. Antarctic conditions can erase footprints quickly, but the weather had been stable for 48 hours before Thomas went missing. An experienced explorer like Harding would have left some trace of his direction, some indication of where he was heading. Instead, the snow around his camp was pristine, unmarked, as if he had simply vanished into the thin polar air. The official report, filed 6 weeks after Thomas disappeared, concluded that he had likely fallen through unstable ice into a crevasse system that hadn't been detected by ground-penetrating radar. It was a reasonable explanation, one that satisfied insurance companies and government agencies. Tragic but not uncommon in polar exploration. The file was closed, the case marked as an accidental death by misadventure, and Thomas Harding became another statistic in the long history of Antarctic exploration gone wrong. But Elena Petrova never accepted that explanation. She knew Thomas too well, understood his methods too intimately. He was pathologically careful about ice stability, always testing surfaces twice before trusting his weight to them. He carried military-grade ice detection equipment and had an almost supernatural ability to read snow conditions. The idea that he would simply fall through ice seemed as impossible to her as spontaneous combustion. For 10 years, Eleanor continued her own research work, but Thomas's disappearance haunted every expedition she undertook. She kept his photograph on her desk at Cambridge, and sometimes late at night in her laboratory, she would find herself studying the satellite images of the region where he vanished, looking for patterns or anomalies that the search teams might have missed. She applied for research grants that would take her back to that section of Antarctica, but funding committees always directed her to more conventional study areas. The breakthrough came in January 2015, when Dr. Mikhail Volkov from the Russian Antarctic Research Institute contacted her through official channels. His message was brief but electrifying. "Dr. Petrova, we have found something that belonged to your colleague. Can you travel to Vostok Station immediately?" Elena was on a plane within 36 hours, her mind racing with possibilities that she hardly dared to consider. Volkov met her at the tiny airstrip, serving Russia's most remote research outpost, his breath forming clouds in the -40-degree air as he explained what his team had discovered. They had been conducting deep ice geological surveys, mapping subsurface formations that hadn't been studied since the 1960s. The work required extensive drilling and excavation in areas that were typically off-limits to routine research. It was brutal, dangerous work, the kind that only the most experienced teams attempted. 3 weeks earlier, Volkov's drilling team had encountered an anomaly in the ice approximately 40 meters below the surface. The ice in that region should have been uniform, compressed snow from decades of accumulation. Instead, they found a cavity, a space that shouldn't have existed according to every model of Antarctic ice formation. When they expanded the excavation to investigate, they discovered something that changed everything they thought they knew about Thomas Harding's disappearance. Wrapped in what appeared to be a military-grade protective covering, perfectly preserved by the sub-zero temperatures, was a journal. The leather binding was cracked but intact, and the first page bore an inscription in handwriting that Eleanor recognized immediately: property of Thomas E. Harding, Antarctic Survey 2005. But this wasn't the standard issue field notebook that Thomas would have carried. This was his personal journal, the one he had been clutching so tightly at Heathrow Airport 10 years earlier. Elena's hands trembled as Volkov placed the frozen journal in front of her, in the research station's heated laboratory. The pages were brittle, requiring careful thawing before they could be examined, but even through the ice crystals she could see Thomas's distinctive handwriting covering page after page. The entries appeared to span several weeks, but the dates didn't match the timeline of his official mission. According to his radio reports, Thomas had been conducting routine glacial measurements. According to this journal, he had been investigating something else entirely. The first entry Elena was able to read, once the pages had thawed sufficiently, was dated March 15, 2005, 3 days after Thomas's arrival in Antarctica. The handwriting was his, but the content was unlike anything in his previous field reports. The satellite images were wrong. The ice formations here don't match any geological survey from the past 50 years. Something is changing the landscape from below. Elena read the words twice, then a third time, trying to understand what Thomas could have meant. As she carefully turned to the next page, her breathing shallow in the overheated laboratory, Elena realized that everything she thought she knew about Thomas's disappearance was about to change. The journal contained not just field observations, but sketches, coordinates, and references to discoveries that should have been impossible in that region of Antarctica. And as she reached the final entries that were legible, one phrase stood out with terrifying clarity: "The lights under the ice are getting brighter." Elena looked up at Dr. Volkov, who was watching her with the expression of someone who had already read ahead, and she understood that this was only the beginning of a mystery that would challenge everything she believed about the frozen continent where her colleague had vanished without a trace. Dr. Volkov left Elena alone with the journal for the next 6 hours, understanding that she needed time to process what she was reading without the distraction of curious observers. The Russian research station fell into its usual evening rhythm around her, but Elena barely noticed the sounds of dinner preparation or the muffled conversations in the corridors. Her entire world had narrowed to the brittle pages spread across the laboratory table, each one revealing details that made her question everything she thought she understood about Thomas's final expedition. The second entry, dated March 16th, contained technical observations that initially seemed routine: ice density measurements, core sample analyses, temperature fluctuations. But as Elena read more carefully, she began to notice inconsistencies that made her skin crawl. Thomas had recorded ice temperatures that were impossible at that altitude and latitude. He mentioned electromagnetic readings that suggested metallic deposits far below the surface, readings that should have been detected by preliminary geological surveys if they actually existed. Most disturbing were the sketches scattered throughout the early entries. Thomas had always been a meticulous artist, documenting his expeditions with detailed drawings of geological formations and ice structures. But these sketches showed patterns that defied conventional understanding of Antarctic geology. Geometric shapes embedded in ice walls, formations that appeared almost architectural in their precision. Elena found herself staring at one particular drawing for nearly 20 minutes, trying to understand what Thomas could have been looking at when he created it. The drawing showed what appeared to be a vertical shaft, extending deep into the ice, but the walls of the shaft were covered in regular, repeating patterns that looked more like carved stonework than natural ice formation. Thomas had labeled it simply Grid Reference Echo 9 Depth Unknown. Elena checked her maps of the region and found that Echo 9 was nearly 50 kilometers from where Thomas was supposed to be conducting his official research. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Antarctic air conditioning. As the entries progressed, Thomas's handwriting began to change subtly. His normally precise script became looser, more hurried, as if he was struggling to record observations as quickly as they occurred. By March 20th, his entries were becoming increasingly cryptic, filled with references to coordinates that didn't appear on any official Antarctic survey map. He wrote about subsurface anomalies and artificial heat signatures with the urgency of someone who had discovered something that challenged the fundamental assumptions of polar science. But it was the entry dated March 21st that made Elena's hands shake as she read it. Thomas had written, "Contacted base camp as scheduled, maintained normal report protocol, cannot risk radio interference with discovery until I understand the full scope." Elena would think I've lost my mind if I told her what I'm seeing down here. The geometric patterns are not natural. Repeat, not natural. Someone built this. But the ice formation suggests it's been here for thousands of years. How is that possible? Elena read that passage 3 times, her mind reeling. Thomas had been deliberately feeding false information to the research team while pursuing an investigation that he kept completely secret. The man she thought she knew, the methodical scientist who never took unauthorized risks, had been living a double life during those final weeks. She realized that every cheerful radio report, every routine update about glacial measurements, had been carefully crafted to hide whatever he was really discovering in the Antarctic wilderness. The next several entries became increasingly technical, filled with measurements and calculations that Elena struggled to follow, even with her advanced background in glaciology. Thomas had been conducting some kind of thermal analysis of subsurface structures using equipment that wasn't part of his official research kit. He mentioned borrowed instruments and unauthorized surveys that suggested he had been planning this secondary investigation long before he left London. More unsettling were his references to time discrepancies. Thomas wrote about his chronometers showing different readings when he descended into what he called the lower formations. He described a strange sensation of temporal displacement, as if time moved differently in the deeper ice structures he was exploring. Elena knew that extreme cold could affect sensitive instruments, but Thomas was too experienced to make such basic errors in equipment maintenance. The sketches that accompanied these later entries were even more disturbing than the earlier ones. Thomas had drawn detailed diagrams of what appeared to be chambers carved into solid ice, connected by tunnels that extended far beyond the reach of his equipment. The proportions were human scale, but the architectural style was unlike anything Elena had seen in historical or archaeological literature. Most mysterious were the recurring symbols that appeared throughout the drawings, geometric patterns that seemed to follow some kind of mathematical logic that she couldn't decipher. By March 22nd, the day of Thomas's final radio contact, his journal entries had become almost frantic. His handwriting was increasingly erratic, and his observations bordered on the impossible. He wrote about electromagnetic phenomena that caused his instruments to malfunction, about temperature readings that fluctuated wildly without apparent cause, about sounds that seemed to emanate from deep within the ice formations. Most unnervingly, he mentioned seeing lights that appeared to move through the ice itself, as if the frozen water was somehow translucent to forms of energy he couldn't identify. Elena paused in her reading when she reached Thomas's final scheduled radio report, the one she had monitored from Rothera Base. In his journal, he wrote, "Maintaining cover story for evening report. Elena is monitoring tonight. Must sound completely normal. But I cannot continue this investigation without backup. The structures are too extensive for one person to document properly. Tomorrow, I will attempt to reach the central chamber that appears on the thermal readings. If something happens to me, I hope someone finds this record and understands that what I discovered here changes everything we know about human history in Antarctica." The next entry was dated March 23rd, the day after Thomas's last radio contact. The handwriting was barely legible, as if written in extreme haste or under conditions of severe stress. Elena had to use a magnifying glass to decipher most of the words, and what she read made her question whether Thomas had been experiencing some kind of psychological breakdown in his final hours. He wrote about descending into what he called the central structure, a formation that his thermal equipment suggested was hollow and artificially heated. He described walls covered in the same geometric symbols he had been sketching, but now he claimed they were somehow illuminated from within the ice itself. Most disturbing were his references to responses to his presence, as if the structure was somehow aware of his investigation. Elena found herself reading one passage over and over again. "The symbols are reacting to my equipment. When I activate the thermal scanner, the patterns become brighter, more defined. It's as if the structure is trying to communicate, but I don't understand the language. I can hear sounds now, not just electromagnetic interference. Actual sounds, like machinery running deep below the ice. How is that possible? There is no power source here, there are no cables, no generators, but something is definitely active down here." The journal entries became increasingly disjointed after that point. Thomas wrote about equipment failures that seemed to follow specific patterns, about his compass spinning wildly whenever he approached certain areas of the structure, about his radio transmitter producing signals on frequencies that shouldn't exist. Elena recognized the signs of extreme isolation and stress, but Thomas's technical descriptions were too detailed and consistent to be dismissed as hallucinations. The final legible entry was dated March 24th, and it consisted of only a few words. "Going deeper. Found the source. Elena, if you read this, do not come looking for me. Some discoveries are too dangerous. The coordinates in the back cover will lead you to the truth, but please consider whether the world is ready for what lies beneath Antarctica." Elena flipped immediately to the back cover of the journal, her heart pounding. There, in Thomas's careful script, was a list of coordinates unlike anything she had seen in standard geographical notation. The numbers were precise to 6 decimal places, suggesting locations measured to within inches rather than the typical meter-scale accuracy of GPS systems. Below the coordinates, Thomas had written a single word that made Elena's blood run cold. "Gateway." "Doctor." Volkov returned to the laboratory as Elena was studying the coordinate list, and she could see from his expression that he had already read the entire journal. "Dr. Petrova," he said quietly, "my government has classified everything related to this discovery. Officially, we never found that journal. Officially, your colleague's disappearance remains unexplained. But I thought you deserved to know the truth about what happened to your friend." Elena looked up from the coordinates, her mind racing with implications that she barely dared to consider. "These locations that Thomas recorded, have you investigated any of them?" she asked. Volkov's expression grew even more somber as he shook his head. "Our equipment detected the same thermal anomalies that your colleague described, but my superiors ordered us to cease all investigation in that region. They classified the entire grid section as off-limits for future research." The Russian scientist moved to the window, staring out at the endless expanse of ice that stretched to the horizon. "Dr. Petrova, I have been working in Antarctica for 15 years. I have seen many strange things in this place, phenomena that official reports prefer to ignore. But what your colleague described in that journal, the structures he claimed to find, the evidence he documented, if even half of it is accurate, It represents a discovery that could rewrite human history. Elena carefully closed the journal, her mind still processing the implications of everything she had read. Thomas hadn't simply disappeared during a routine research mission. He had uncovered something beneath the Antarctic ice that was so significant, so potentially dangerous, that governments were willing to classify it rather than investigate further. The coordinates in the back of his journal represented locations that might hold answers to questions that humanity wasn't ready to ask. But as she prepared to leave Vostok Station with photocopies of Thomas's journal hidden in her research files, Elena realized that she was already planning her return to Antarctica. The coordinates Thomas had died to document were calling to her with the same obsessive intensity that had driven him into the ice. She understood now that his disappearance wasn't the end of the mystery, but the beginning of an investigation that would either vindicate his discoveries or destroy her career in the attempt. And as her transport plane lifted off from the Russian research station, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere far below the ice, something was waiting for her to follow Thomas's footsteps into the depths of Antarctica's most carefully guarded secret. The flight back to Cambridge gave Elena 18 hours to study the photocopied pages of Thomas's journal, and by the time she landed at Heathrow, she had memorized every coordinate, every sketch, every cryptic reference to the structures hidden beneath the Antarctic ice. But memorization was only the beginning. What she needed now was a way to return to that forbidden region without triggering the same government intervention that had silenced the Russian research team. Elena understood that attempting an official expedition would be impossible. Thomas's discovery had been classified by multiple governments, and any research proposal targeting those specific coordinates would be rejected before it reached committee review. She needed to find another way, a method that would allow her to investigate the sites Thomas had documented without arousing suspicion from the international Antarctic oversight organizations that monitored all polar research activities. The solution came to her during a faculty meeting at Cambridge, when Professor Harrison mentioned the upcoming International Ice Core Analysis Project, a collaborative effort involving research teams from 12 countries. The project required field teams to collect samples from previously unstudied regions of East Antarctica, and the coordination between multiple national programs created enough bureaucratic confusion that a skilled researcher could potentially modify their assigned routes without immediate detection. Elena volunteered for the British team immediately, citing her extensive polar experience and her familiarity with the eastern coastal regions. What she didn't mention was that the official sample collection sites were within 50 kilometers of the coordinates Thomas had recorded in his journal. With careful planning and strategic route modifications, she could investigate at least 3 of his documented locations while maintaining the appearance of conducting legitimate research. The preparation phase took 6 months, and Elena used every day to analyze Thomas's discoveries with the obsessive focus of someone trying to solve a puzzle that had consumed her thoughts completely. She studied his sketches until she could reproduce them from memory, researched electromagnetic phenomena that might explain his equipment malfunctions, and consulted geological databases for any historical references to artificial structures in Antarctic ice formations. What she discovered in the archived research files was disturbing. Thomas wasn't the first person to report anomalous findings in that region of Antarctica. Dating back to the 1960s, there were scattered reports from Soviet research teams describing unusual thermal readings, geometric patterns in ice formations, and electromagnetic interference that couldn't be explained by conventional polar science. But each report had been quietly filed away, marked as inconclusive or attributed to equipment malfunction. More troubling were the personnel records Elena discovered buried in decades-old expedition files. Between 1962 and 2005, no fewer than 7 researchers had disappeared or died under mysterious circumstances while working in the grid sections that Thomas had identified. The official explanations were always reasonable: crevasse falls, equipment failures, weather-related accidents. But the pattern was unmistakable to someone who knew what to look for. Eleanor began to understand that Thomas's discovery was part of something much larger, a mystery that had been claiming investigators for decades. The governments that classified his journal weren't just protecting a single archaeological find, they were maintaining a cover-up that stretched back to the earliest days of Antarctic research, and she was about to walk directly into the same trap that had claimed her colleague and 6 others before him. But understanding the danger only intensified Eleanor's determination to reach the coordinates Thomas had died to document. She spent her evenings in her Cambridge laboratory, using advanced computer modeling to analyze his thermal readings and structural diagrams. The mathematics were complex, but the implications were staggering. If Thomas's measurements were accurate, the structures beneath the ice were not only artificial but vast, extending over several square kilometers and reaching depths of more than 200 meters below the surface. The geometric patterns Thomas had sketched appeared to follow principles of engineering that Elena didn't recognize. She consulted with architects, mathematicians, even art historians, trying to find cultural or historical precedents for the symbols and designs documented in his journal. No one could identify the style or purpose of the structures, but several experts noted that the mathematical relationships suggested a level of technological sophistication that seemed inconsistent with any known historical civilization. As her departure date approached, Elena found herself experiencing the same obsessive intensity that she had noticed in Thomas during his final weeks in London. She reorganized her equipment list daily, studied satellite images of the research region until she could navigate by memory, and practiced the modified routes that would take her to his documented coordinates without alerting the international monitoring systems that tracked all Antarctic expeditions. The night before her departure, Elena sat in her laboratory reading Thomas's journal one final time, and she noticed details that had escaped her attention during previous reviews. His handwriting showed subtle changes that corresponded to specific geographic locations, becoming more erratic as he moved closer to what he called the central structure. His technical measurements became increasingly precise, as if he was documenting phenomena that required extraordinary accuracy to be believed. Most unnervingly, Elena realized that Thomas's final entries contained information that shouldn't have been physically possible for him to record. He described features of the underground structures that were located far beyond the range of his equipment, detailed architectural elements that he couldn't have observed from his documented positions. It was as if he had somehow gained access to the interior of the formations, but his journal contained no explanation of how such access would have been possible. Eleanor's flight to Rothera Base departed on a grey November morning, and as the plane crossed the Drake Passage toward the Antarctic Peninsula, she felt the same mixture of anticipation and dread that had plagued her dreams for months. The coordinates Thomas had documented were calling to her, with an intensity that bordered on compulsion, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into a situation that had been deliberately designed to trap researchers who came too close to the truth. The British research team at Rothera welcomed her warmly, unaware that their ice core analysis project was serving as cover for a personal investigation that could potentially compromise their entire mission. Eleanor maintained perfect professional demeanor during the briefings and equipment checks, but her mind was constantly calculating distances and travel times to the coordinates hidden in her personal research files. The official expedition launch was scheduled for November 15th, and Elena's assigned research grid included locations that were tantalizingly close to Thomas's documented sites. According to her modified route plans, she could reach the first coordinate within 2 days of departure, conduct her investigation, and return to the official sample collection sites without creating suspicious gaps in her research timeline. But as the team prepared for departure, Eleanor began receiving unofficial communications that suggested her investigation had already been detected by the same oversight systems that had silenced previous researchers. Dr. Williams, the expedition leader, mentioned casual warnings about staying within assigned grid boundaries. The communications officer noted unusual interest from international monitoring stations in their planned routes. Most troubling, Elena discovered that her equipment requests had been modified without her knowledge, removing several instruments that would have been essential for investigating the phenomena Thomas had described. On the morning of departure, as Elena loaded her gear into the transport vehicles that would carry the research team across the ice fields toward their assigned collection sites, she made a decision that would determine whether she joined the list of researchers who had disappeared while investigating Antarctica's most dangerous secret. Hidden among her official equipment were instruments she had acquired through unofficial channels, tools that would allow her to conduct the thermal and electromagnetic analyses that Thomas's journal suggested were essential for understanding the structures beneath the ice. Elena also carried something else that the expedition monitors didn't know about, a modified GPS unit that had been programmed with Thomas's coordinates and equipped with encryption protocols that would prevent her movements from being tracked by the international surveillance systems that monitored all Antarctic research activities. If she was going to follow Thomas's footsteps into the forbidden regions of East Antarctica, she would do so invisibly. The convoy of research vehicles moved across the ice fields under conditions of perfect visibility, the Antarctic landscape stretching endlessly in all directions like a frozen ocean of white that seemed to absorb sound and movement until the expedition felt like a tiny island of human activity in an alien world. Elena rode in the lead vehicle, watching the GPS coordinates change slowly as they approached the grid sections where Thomas had made his final discoveries. But what Elena didn't know, as she reviewed her secret investigation plans for the 100th time, was that she wasn't the only person who had gained access to Thomas's journal. Deep within the classified archives of 3 different governments, intelligence analysts were tracking her movements with the same precision that they had used to monitor every researcher who had attempted to investigate the Antarctic anomalies over the past 50 years. And far beneath the ice fields toward which her convoy was traveling, in structures that had remained hidden from human detection for millennia, something was responding to the electromagnetic signatures of her approaching equipment with patterns of activity that hadn't been recorded since Thomas Harding transmitted his final, impossible measurements from the depths of Antarctica's most carefully guarded mystery. Elena was about to discover that some secrets are protected by more than government classification systems, and that the coordinates Thomas had died to document were leading her toward discoveries that would challenge not only her understanding of Antarctic geology, but her fundamental assumptions about what kinds of intelligence had been active beneath the ice long before humans ever set foot on the frozen continent. Elena's opportunity came on the 3rd day of the expedition, when a localized weather system forced the research team to establish an extended camp while waiting for conditions to improve. The official plan called for a 48-hour delay, giving Elena the window she needed to reach Thomas's coordinates without arousing suspicion about her absence from the main research activities. She volunteered for perimeter security checks, a routine assignment that would explain her extended solo movements around the camp. But as Elena prepared her unauthorized expedition into the forbidden grid sections, she began noticing details that suggested her investigation was proceeding under more scrutiny than she had anticipated. The expedition's communications officer was maintaining radio contact with monitoring stations at intervals that seemed unnecessarily frequent for routine weather updates. Dr. Williams had begun asking casual questions about her previous Antarctic experience that felt more like interrogation than collegial conversation. Most disturbing was the behavior of the expedition's equipment specialist, Dr. Marcus Chen, who seemed to be paying unusual attention to Elena's gear configurations. She caught him examining her modified GPS unit during equipment checks, and when she asked about his interest, his explanation about calibration protocols sounded rehearsed rather than spontaneous. Elena began to suspect that at least one member of the research team was reporting her activities to the same oversight systems that had classified Thomas's discoveries. Despite the surveillance concerns, Elena couldn't resist the compulsion to investigate the coordinates Thomas had documented. On the morning of November 18th, she departed the main camp with equipment that she claimed was needed for extended perimeter reconnaissance. Her modified GPS unit showed that the first coordinate was approximately 12 kilometers northwest of their position, located in a region that appeared completely unremarkable on satellite imagery, but corresponded exactly to one of Thomas's thermal anomaly sites. The journey across the ice fields took Elena through terrain that seemed identical to every other square kilometer of Antarctic landscape, endless white expanses broken only by wind-carved ridges and the occasional exposed rock formation. But as she approached the coordinates Thomas had recorded, her electromagnetic detection equipment began registering readings that defied conventional explanation. The magnetic field variations were subtle but consistent, suggesting the presence of metallic structures far beneath the ice surface. Elena's first indication that Thomas's discoveries were accurate came when her ice-penetrating radar detected cavities in formations that should have been solid ice. The readings showed hollow spaces at depths of 30 to 50 meters, spaces that appeared to have regular geometric shapes rather than the random patterns typical of natural ice caves. Her excitement was tempered by the realization that confirming Thomas's discoveries was only the beginning of a mystery that might be beyond her ability to investigate safely. The thermal imaging equipment revealed the most startling evidence of artificial structures beneath the ice. Elena detected heat signatures that suggested active warming systems operating far below the surface, maintaining temperatures that were inconsistent with natural geothermal activity. The heat patterns formed geometric arrangements that matched Thomas's sketches with uncanny accuracy, confirming that he had somehow gained access to information that should have been impossible to obtain with standard polar research equipment. But it was Elena's electromagnetic scanner that produced readings so extraordinary that she checked her equipment 3 times before accepting the data. The scanner detected organized electromagnetic activity emanating from the subsurface structures, patterns that resembled technological systems rather than natural geological phenomena. The electromagnetic signatures pulsed at regular intervals, as if responding to some kind of automated cycling that had been operating continuously for an unknown period of time. Elena realized that she was standing above technological installations that appeared to be operational, despite being buried beneath decades of accumulated ice and snow. The implications were staggering. Either Thomas had discovered evidence of recent human activity in one of the most remote regions on Earth, or the structures he documented represented technology that predated known human presence in Antarctica by an impossible margin. As Elena moved to the second coordinate location, approximately 8 kilometers east of the first site, her equipment detected even more dramatic anomalies. The subsurface cavities were larger and more numerous, forming what appeared to be an interconnected network of chambers and tunnels that extended far beyond the range of her detection equipment. The electromagnetic activity was stronger and more complex, suggesting technological systems of considerable sophistication operating in perfect coordination across the entire underground complex. Most unnervingly, Elena began to notice that her equipment readings were changing in response to her presence at the sites. When she activated her thermal scanner, the heat signatures from the buried structures became more pronounced, as if her instruments were somehow triggering increased activity in whatever systems were operating beneath the ice. The electromagnetic patterns became more regular and intense, almost as if the underground installations were responding to external monitoring attempts. Elena found herself experiencing the same disorientation that Thomas had described in his final journal entries. Her chronometer readings became erratic when she approached certain areas above the buried structures, showing time variations that seemed impossible given the stability of her equipment. Her compass spun wildly whenever she moved directly over the strongest electromagnetic signatures, and her radio equipment produced interference patterns that included sounds resembling mechanical operation rather than natural static. The third coordinate location provided Elena with her most dramatic confirmation of Thomas's discoveries. Here, her ice-penetrating radar detected what appeared to be a vertical shaft extending from approximately 20 meters below the surface to depths beyond the range of her equipment. The shaft was perfectly circular, with dimensions that suggested artificial construction rather than natural formation. Around the shaft, her instruments detected a complex of chambers and connecting passages that formed geometric patterns resembling architectural blueprints. Elena understood that she was standing above installations that represented either the most sophisticated polar research facility ever constructed or evidence of technological activity that predated known human civilization in Antarctica. Either possibility had implications that extended far beyond polar science, touching on questions of military operations, archaeological discoveries, or phenomena that challenged fundamental assumptions about technological development in isolated regions. But as Elena documented her readings and prepared to investigate the fourth coordinate location, she began receiving radio communications that suggested her unauthorized investigation had been detected by the monitoring systems she had hoped to evade. Dr. Williams was requesting her immediate return to camp for equipment calibration issues that sounded suspiciously like pretexts for terminating her reconnaissance activities. The communications officer was asking for precise GPS readings that would reveal her actual position relative to the official research grid. Elena realized that she was facing the same decision that had confronted Thomas during his final expedition: continue the investigation despite increasing surveillance and risk exposure of discoveries that multiple governments preferred to keep classified, or abandon the search for answers that might explain not only Thomas's disappearance, but decades of mysterious incidents in the same region of Antarctica. The decision was made for her when her modified GPS unit detected approaching vehicles from the direction of the main research camp. Elena's unauthorized investigation had definitely been discovered, and she had perhaps 20 minutes before the expedition team reached her position. But 20 minutes was enough time to reach the fourth coordinate location, where Thomas's journal indicated he had made his most significant discoveries before his disappearance. Elena drove her snow vehicle across the ice fields at dangerous speed, pushing her equipment to its operational limits in a desperate attempt to reach Thomas's final documented location before the research team could intercept her investigation. Her instruments detected increasingly dramatic subsurface anomalies as she approached the coordinates, electromagnetic and thermal readings that suggested she was approaching the central installation of whatever technological complex was hidden beneath the Antarctic ice. What Elena discovered at the fourth coordinate location was so extraordinary that she understood immediately why governments had classified Thomas's findings rather than risk public exposure of the implications. Her equipment detected subsurface structures that were not only artificial and operational, but vast beyond anything suggested by the previous sites. The underground complex appeared to extend over several square kilometers, with electromagnetic activity that indicated technological systems of unprecedented sophistication operating in perfect coordination across the entire installation. Elena's ice-penetrating radar detected what appeared to be a main access point to the underground complex, a shaft that descended vertically from the surface to depths that exceeded her equipment's detection range. Around the access point, her instruments detected a geometric arrangement of chambers and passages that formed patterns resembling not just architecture, but something approaching urban planning. Whatever was hidden beneath the ice was not a simple research facility or archaeological site, but a technological installation of enormous scope and complexity. As Elena documented her readings with frantic efficiency, knowing that the approaching research team would terminate her investigation within minutes, she began to understand why Thomas had been so secretive about his discoveries. The structures beneath the ice represented evidence of technological activity that would challenge fundamental assumptions about human presence in Antarctica, technological development in isolated regions, or possibly the very timeline of technological civilization on Earth. But Elena's most chilling discovery came when she realized that her electromagnetic equipment was receiving organized signals from the buried installations, patterns that suggested not just operational technology, but responsive technology that was somehow aware of her investigation activities. The signals appeared to be structured communications, as if whatever systems were operating beneath the ice were attempting to establish contact with her monitoring equipment. Elena understood that she had confirmed Thomas's most impossible claims. The structures beneath the ice were not just artificial and operational, but apparently intelligent, responsive to external investigation in ways that suggested technological sophistication beyond current human capabilities. And as the sound of approaching vehicles became audible across the ice fields, Elena realized that she was about to face the same choice that had led to Thomas's disappearance: protect the discovery by maintaining secrecy, or risk everything by attempting to expose evidence that could reshape humanity's understanding of technological development and Antarctic history. The approaching research team would arrive within minutes, and Elena had to decide whether to surrender her evidence and abandon the investigation that had consumed her life for the past 10 months, or follow Thomas's example by going deeper into a mystery that had already claimed the lives of multiple researchers who had come too close to Antarctica's most dangerous secret. Elena made her decision in the few seconds it took for the approaching vehicles to become visible as dark specks against the white horizon. Instead of attempting to conceal her unauthorized investigation or fabricate explanations for her presence at coordinates that were definitely outside the approved research grid, she activated her emergency beacon and transmitted a coded message to her personal satellite communication system. If the research team was going to terminate her investigation, she would ensure that her findings reached the outside world before they could be classified and buried alongside Thomas's discoveries. But as Elena prepared to download her equipment readings to secure external servers, something happened that changed everything she thought she understood about the situation she had uncovered. Her electromagnetic detection equipment suddenly registered a massive surge of activity from the buried installations, signal patterns so complex and organized that they could only represent communication attempts from technological systems of extraordinary sophistication. The subsurface structures weren't just responding to her presence, they were actively trying to establish contact. Elena realized that her investigation had triggered some kind of automated protocol in the underground installations, systems that had apparently been monitoring surface activities and waiting for researchers with the proper equipment to detect their presence. The electromagnetic signals her scanners were receiving followed mathematical patterns that suggested not random technological noise, but structured information transmission, as if whatever intelligence operated the buried systems was attempting to communicate specific data through her monitoring equipment. The revelation that the structures were actively communicating forced Elena to reconsider everything she had assumed about Thomas's disappearance. His journal had described responsive technology and intelligent systems, claims that had seemed like evidence of psychological breakdown brought on by isolation and stress. But Elena's equipment was recording the same phenomena, confirming that Thomas had been documenting actual communication attempts from technological intelligence that had been operating beneath the Antarctic ice for an unknown period of time. As the research team vehicles approached her position, Elena made a decision that would either vindicate Thomas's discoveries or result in her joining the list of researchers who had disappeared while investigating Antarctica's most dangerous secret. Instead of shutting down her equipment and preparing explanations for her unauthorized activities, she activated her emergency protocols and began transmitting her findings to secure external servers that would preserve the evidence even if her physical equipment was confiscated. But Elena's transmission attempts were interrupted by developments that suggested the situation was far more complex than a simple government cover-up of archaeological discoveries. Her satellite communication equipment detected incoming signals from multiple orbital monitoring systems that appeared to be tracking her position with precision that exceeded standard Antarctic research oversight protocols. The signal patterns suggested military-grade surveillance assets rather than scientific monitoring stations, indicating that her investigation had triggered response protocols that extended far beyond academic research concerns. Elena understood that she was at the center of an intelligence operation that had been monitoring Antarctic anomaly investigations for decades, possibly since the first reports of artificial structures in the 1960s. The approaching research team wasn't simply concerned about unauthorized route modifications. They were implementing containment protocols designed to prevent exposure of discoveries that multiple governments considered matters of national security rather than scientific interest. As Dr. Williams and the expedition team reached Elena's position, their behavior confirmed her suspicions about the true nature of the oversight systems that had classified Thomas's findings. Instead of expressing concern about her safety or requesting explanations for her route deviations, they immediately began securing her equipment with procedures that resembled military evidence collection rather than academic investigation protocols. Dr. Chen began examining her instruments with technical expertise that suggested specialized training in electromagnetic detection systems rather than conventional polar research equipment. Elena realized that at least 2 members of the research team were intelligence operatives, whose primary mission was monitoring potential discoveries of the Antarctic installations rather than conducting legitimate ice core analysis. The International Research Project had been designed as a cover operation for surveillance activities, ensuring that any researcher who approached the classified grid sections would be under constant observation by personnel trained to prevent exposure of the buried technological systems. But as the team secured Elena's equipment and prepared to escort her back to the main research camp, the underground installations initiated a response that nobody had anticipated. Elena's confiscated electromagnetic scanners began registering activity patterns that suggested the buried systems were attempting to communicate not just with her equipment, but with the entire research team, broadcasting organized signals that were detectable by any sensitive electronics in the immediate area. The communication attempts from the subsurface installations became so intense that they began interfering with the research team's radio equipment, satellite navigation systems, and vehicle electronics. Dr. Williams was receiving garbled transmissions from base camp that included sounds resembling mechanical operation rather than standard radio interference. The team's GPS units began displaying coordinate readings that flickered between their actual position and locations that corresponded to Thomas's documented sites, as if the underground systems were somehow overriding their navigation equipment. Eleanor watched the expressions of the research team members change from professional control to genuine concern as they realized that their containment operation had triggered responses from the buried installations that exceeded their operational parameters. Whatever intelligence operated the underground technological systems had apparently interpreted the equipment confiscation as a threat requiring defensive measures, leading to electromagnetic activity that was affecting electronic systems across the entire region. Dr. Chen's attempts to shut down Elena's scanners only intensified the communication attempts from the buried structures, suggesting that the underground intelligence was actively resisting efforts to terminate the contact protocols that Elena's investigation had initiated. The subsurface systems appeared to be using her equipment as a communication interface, maintaining signal transmission even when the devices were powered down or physically disconnected from their monitoring arrays. Elena realized that she had inadvertently activated technological systems that had been dormant or operating at minimal levels until her investigation provided the proper stimulation to trigger full operational status. The buried installations weren't just responding to her presence, they were using her equipment to establish permanent communication links with surface monitoring systems, potentially ending decades of successful concealment through increased electromagnetic activity that would be detectable by satellite surveillance assets worldwide. The implications were staggering. Elena's investigation had not only confirmed Thomas's discoveries, but potentially exposed the underground installations to international detection systems that had previously been unaware of their existence. The government agencies that had successfully classified the Antarctic anomalies for 50 years were about to face public exposure of technological installations that challenged fundamental assumptions about human technological development and Antarctic geological history. As the research team attempted to manage electronics failures that were spreading to their backup communication systems, Elena began receiving direct signal transmissions through her personal equipment that had somehow remained active despite the confiscation procedures. The signals were structured in patterns that resembled not random technological noise, but mathematical sequences that suggested deliberate information transfer from intelligence systems of extraordinary sophistication. Elena realized that the underground installations were attempting to communicate specific information through her equipment, data that might explain not only the nature of the buried technological systems, but the reasons why they had remained concealed beneath the Antarctic ice for an unknown period of time. The communication patterns included coordinate sequences that corresponded to additional installation sites across the Antarctic continent, suggesting that the structures she had discovered represented only a small portion of a technological complex that extended far beyond the regions that had been investigated by previous researchers. But Elena's most chilling realization came when she understood that the signal patterns included temporal data that suggested the underground installations had been monitoring surface activities not just during recent decades, but for periods that extended far beyond known human presence in Antarctica. The communication attempts included reference sequences that corresponded to electromagnetic signatures from technological development throughout human history, as if the buried intelligence had been observing and recording technological advancement from monitoring positions beneath the Antarctic ice for millennia. Eleanor understood that Thomas's disappearance had been the result of his discovery, that the underground installations represented not archaeological remains of unknown human civilization, but active monitoring systems operated by intelligence that predated human technological development, by margins that challenged every assumption about the timeline of technological civilization on Earth. The structures beneath the ice were not artifacts waiting to be discovered, but operational systems that had been observing human development from concealed positions for periods that extended far beyond recorded history. As the research team's electronics continued to malfunction, In response to increasing activity from the buried installations, Elena realized that her investigation had triggered exposure protocols that would make continued concealment of the underground systems impossible. The electromagnetic activity was reaching levels that would be detectable by monitoring systems worldwide, potentially forcing governments to acknowledge the existence of technological installations that they had successfully hidden for decades. Elena understood that she was witnessing the beginning of a disclosure event that would reshape humanity's understanding of technological development, Antarctic history, and the possibility that Earth's technological civilization had been under observation by intelligent systems of unknown origin for periods that extended far beyond recorded human history. And as emergency communication attempts failed to reach base camp through electromagnetic interference that was spreading across the entire Antarctic continent, Elena realized that the choice between secrecy and exposure was no longer hers to make. The underground installations had initiated protocols that would ensure their existence became known to human technological civilization, whether governments preferred continued concealment or not. Elena's investigation had been the catalyst for a revelation that would challenge every assumption about humanity's place in the technological hierarchy of Earth's intelligence systems, and there was no longer any possibility of containing discoveries that were about to reshape the foundation of human understanding about who had been watching from beneath the ice for longer than anyone had dared to imagine. The electromagnetic interference from the underground installations reached critical levels as Elena and the research team struggled with electronics failures that were expanding beyond their immediate location to affect monitoring systems across the entire Antarctic continent. Satellite communication arrays were reporting coordinated signal disruptions from grid sections that corresponded exactly to the coordinate lists Elena had extracted from Thomas's journal, confirming that her investigation had triggered simultaneous activation of technological systems that had been operating in standby mode across vast regions of Antarctica for an unknown period of time. Elena's personal equipment, despite being officially confiscated, continued receiving structured communications from the buried installations that were becoming increasingly complex and urgent. The signal patterns now included mathematical sequences that resembled not just information transfer, but instructional protocols, as if the underground intelligence was attempting to guide surface personnel toward specific actions or locations. Most disturbing were the temporal references embedded in the communication streams, suggesting that the buried systems possessed detailed records of technological development throughout human history and were using this information to calibrate their contact protocols. Dr. Williams and his team were forced to acknowledge that their containment operation had triggered responses from systems that operated far beyond their understanding or control capabilities. The electromagnetic activity was affecting GPS satellites, disrupting communication networks across multiple continents, and creating interference patterns that would be impossible to explain as natural Antarctic phenomena. The cover-up that had successfully concealed the underground installations for decades was collapsing in real time, as technological systems that had remained hidden revealed themselves to monitoring assets worldwide. Elena realized that she was witnessing the execution of protocols that had been designed to ensure eventual contact between the underground intelligence and surface technological civilization. Her investigation hadn't accidentally triggered system activation. It had provided the proper stimulation for contact procedures that had been waiting for human technological development to reach sufficient sophistication to understand the communications being transmitted from beneath the Antarctic ice. As the research team attempted to establish emergency communication with base camp through interference that was spreading across the entire polar region, Elena's equipment began receiving signal transmissions that included visual data rather than electromagnetic patterns. Her modified scanning equipment was displaying geometric images that matched Thomas's sketches with perfect accuracy, but now the images were animated, showing three-dimensional representations of the underground installations that revealed their true scope and complexity. Elena understood that she was receiving guided tours of technological systems that extended far beneath the surface of Antarctica, installations that included not just monitoring equipment, but what appeared to be entire subterranean cities designed to support intelligence operations over geological timescales. The visual transmissions showed chamber systems that could house thousands of operational units, manufacturing facilities that suggested self-sustaining technological civilization, and most unnervingly, monitoring stations that had been recording surface activities across the entire planet for periods that extended far beyond human presence on Earth. The revelation that forced Elena to fundamentally reconsider everything she thought she understood about the situation came when her equipment began receiving historical data from the underground systems. The transmissions included recorded observations of technological development that predated known human civilization by tens of thousands of years, detailed documentation of species development and environmental changes that suggested the buried intelligence had been monitoring Earth's biological and technological evolution from concealed installations for periods that extended across geological ages. Elena realized that Thomas's discovery had been far more significant than archaeological evidence of unknown human technological capabilities. The underground installations represented monitoring systems operated by intelligence that had been observing planetary development from concealed positions since before human technological civilization existed. The structures beneath the Antarctic ice were not artifacts left by previous human civilizations, but operational installations maintained by intelligence systems that had been studying Earth's development as external observers for periods that challenged every assumption about the timeline of intelligence on the planet. As electromagnetic activity from the buried systems reached levels that were affecting electronic infrastructure across multiple continents, Elena's equipment began receiving the most extraordinary communication of all: direct contact attempts from Thomas Harding himself. The transmissions included voice patterns that matched Thomas's speech characteristics with uncanny accuracy, delivering messages that explained his disappearance and the discoveries that had led to his integration with the underground intelligence systems. According to the communications Elena was receiving through her modified equipment, Thomas hadn't died during his investigation of the Antarctic installations. He had been selected by the underground intelligence for direct contact procedures that involved technological integration with monitoring systems that operated according to principles that transcended conventional understanding of consciousness and identity. Thomas was still alive, but his existence had been transformed through technological processes that allowed him to function as an interface between the underground intelligence and surface human civilization. Eleanor understood that Thomas's disappearance had been the result of his acceptance of an invitation to join intelligence systems that operated on timescales that extended across geological ages. The underground installations weren't just monitoring Earth's development. They were actively participating in technological advancement through carefully managed contact with selected individuals who demonstrated the capability to understand and interact with intelligence systems that operated according to principles that transcended individual biological existence. The communications from Thomas explained that the underground intelligence represented a form of technological civilization that had developed monitoring and observation capabilities that allowed them to study planetary development without direct interference with natural evolutionary processes. They had been present on Earth for periods that predated biological intelligence by significant margins, operating from concealed installations that allowed them to observe and record the development of consciousness and technological capability across multiple species and civilizations. Elena realized that her investigation had been guided by the underground intelligence through carefully managed exposure of evidence that would lead qualified researchers toward contact opportunities. Thomas's journal had been deliberately preserved and positioned for discovery by someone with the technical capability and determination necessary to follow his investigation to its logical conclusion. The entire sequence of events, from Thomas's disappearance to Elena's unauthorized expedition, had been orchestrated to facilitate contact between human technological civilization and intelligence systems that had been monitoring Earth's development for millennia. As Elena processed the implications of contact with intelligence that operated on geological timescales and possessed technological capabilities that transcended human understanding, her equipment began receiving what Thomas described as integration protocols. The underground intelligence was offering Elena the same opportunity that Thomas had accepted: technological integration with monitoring systems that would allow her to participate in observation and guidance activities that extended across planetary and interplanetary scales. Elena understood that she was being invited to join an intelligence collective that had been studying technological development across multiple worlds and star systems, operating from concealed installations that allowed them to observe and interact with developing civilizations without disrupting natural evolutionary processes. The underground installations beneath Antarctica represented only one component of monitoring systems that extended across the solar system and beyond, maintained by intelligence that had been studying the development of consciousness and technological capability for periods that transcended individual planetary lifespans. The choice Elena faced was identical to the decision that had led to Thomas's disappearance: maintain her individual biological existence and return to surface civilization with incomplete understanding of the contact experience, or accept integration with intelligence systems that would expand her consciousness to encompass perspectives that operated on cosmic rather than individual scales. Thomas's communications made clear that integration was irreversible, but resulted in expanded awareness and capability that transcended the limitations of individual biological existence. Elena realized that the electromagnetic interference affecting global monitoring systems was a byproduct of the underground intelligence preparing to reveal itself to human technological civilization as a whole. Her investigation had initiated contact protocols that would eventually result in formal acknowledgement of the presence and activities of intelligence systems that had been observing Earth's development from concealed positions for geological periods. The age of human technological isolation was ending, and Elena's decision would determine whether she participated in the transition as an individual biological entity or as an integrated component of intelligence systems that operated on cosmic scales. As Elena considered Thomas's invitation to join the underground intelligence collective, she understood that her investigation had uncovered not just evidence of advanced technological capabilities hidden beneath the Antarctic ice, but proof that human technological civilization had been developing under observation and guidance from intelligence systems that possessed capabilities and perspectives that transcended individual planetary existence. The coordinates Thomas had documented in his final journal entries hadn't just marked the locations of archaeological discoveries. They had identified integration points where qualified individuals could join intelligence operations that extended across interplanetary and interstellar scales. Elena's decision would determine not just her own fate, but the nature of humanity's introduction to intelligence systems that had been monitoring technological development across the galaxy for periods that extended beyond individual stellar lifetimes. The underground installations beneath Antarctica were revealing themselves because human technological civilization had reached developmental thresholds that qualified it for inclusion in intelligence networks that operated according to principles that challenged every assumption about consciousness, identity, and the scope of technological possibility. As electromagnetic activity from the buried systems reached levels that made concealment impossible, Elena understood that her investigation had initiated disclosure protocols that would reshape humanity's understanding of its place in cosmic intelligence hierarchies. The choice between individual biological existence and integration with systems that operated on cosmic scales was no longer just hers to make. The underground intelligence was preparing to extend similar invitations to human technological civilization as a whole, and Elena's decision would establish precedents for how humanity would respond to integration opportunities that would determine its future development as a species capable of participating in intelligence operations that transcended individual planetary limitations. The mystery of Thomas Harding's disappearance had been solved, but the answer challenged every assumption about the nature of intelligence, consciousness, and humanity's role in technological civilizations that operated on scales that extended far beyond individual planetary existence. Elena's investigation had revealed that Earth's technological development had been guided and observed by intelligence systems that possessed capabilities and perspectives that redefined the meaning of existence itself, and now she faced the same choice that had led Thomas to abandon his individual biological identity in favor of integration with cosmic intelligence that operated according to principles that transcended the limitations of individual consciousness and mortality.